Hello everyone, today I'm taking a look at Resident Evil Code Veronica X specifically. So this was the port or remake that they did a while ago. The Dreamcast had some amazingly good games on it. Unfortunately, this one was salvaged along with things like Sonic Adventure and Shenmue. And we finally kind of get to play it. And of course, I'm playing this because the Code Veronica remake is coming out, and I wanted to get basically the original version. I kind of, treat these things as the real version of these games. Same thing with Demon Souls when the remake got announced. I actually owned it, but I went back and played it a little bit more, and I was like, yeah, no, I'm not really into this. And sure enough, when the remake came around, they mechanically stayed the same, so yeah. But Code Veronica, what did I think of it? It's kind of a conflicting game because I think in some aspects Veronica has a very good story. It's just that the gameplay feels just really weak. It's not necessarily bad, but if I were to put it up Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, it's maybe on par with 1, if not a little bit worse, which feels weird. Maybe it's the pacing, or maybe it's just the way that the enemies, I don't know, react. Also in 3, they introduced this whole ammo mixing system, which isn't present in this one, which honestly I kind of appreciate because it was very tedious and onerous to keep carrying around a bunch of different ammo types that you may or may not use. And, there's, not sure what kind of ammo you're going to need. I mean, it was kind of a hit or miss mechanic. But yeah, this one is really interesting because I think that people really consider this to be the real Resident Evil 3, and I don't think that's even the fan theory. That's like the developers themselves saying this was the real story they want to do, while Resident Evil 3, dually, feels more like a side story and DLC for Resident Evil 2, while this one is the real story that actually continues. And even that being said, Code Veronica's story, it's not necessarily like bad. I mean, it's a good story. It's just that it doesn't really impact anything else in the game. It is interesting to see though the evolution of certain characters like Chris, and not really Claire because she doesn't come around until like Revelations 2. Like Claire is kind of irrelevant, sadly. So this is kind of her game. This is Claire's game. And you play as Claire and Chris in this one. And it's interesting to the evolution of Chris and Wesker. And really, this is like a setup for Resident Evil 5. And it feels more balanced if this was actually the third game. Because in retrospect, you have a Chris game, then a Leon game, then a Chris game, then a Leon game, then a Chris game, then an Everyone game, and then Ethan and Chris, and then Ethan and Leon. Or just Leon, Ethan was done by 9. Anyway, so it was kind of like a 1-2-1-2 pattern that made more sense. So I understand there's a lot of people who consider this to be the real Resident Evil 3. And I can totally see that. I can totally get it. It's just that on the whole, do I feel like as a real Resident Evil fan, we've been missing out on this amazing experience we've never known about? And not really. I mean, the thing is that I do wish the story was more... Like, the story is good, but the way it injects itself into the overall structure of the Resident Evil series isn't super important because they came in with this idea of a side story so that it's detached from everything else. So it doesn't make it bad. It's just in the overall scheme of things, it is kind of a skippable thing. Again, the characterization I think is really good and really interesting. Another big thing of the course they introduced in this is kind of the financiers of the Umbrella Corporation. So you have Oswald E. Spencer's kind of the research and the science part, I believe, behind it, while the Ashfords were the ones who were basically financing and collaborating and started Umbrella after the research was found. And so the Ashfords are like another villain family or story in this game, in this series. And so you have who is it? Alexis, who is the sister, and Alfred, who is the brother. And so this brother-sister team is, poetically mirrored by Claire and Chris, who essentially have to go up against this other brother-sister team. So it's a kind of a unique setting and story, especially for the Ashfords, because they have this dynamic where, of course, there's kind of the, they're both twins. They have this thing about genetic superiority. There's implied incest. It's kind of very, I don't want to say cliche, but when you ever have these twin-like characters and elements in certain games, and it's always some corrupt aristocratic family, it's kind of checking the boxes in a lot of ways. But it's still a very well told story, and there are some very interesting twists along the way as well. Um, Essentially, Alfred is infatuated with his sister and worships her, and to the point where he wants to become her in certain ways. And there's sort of dialogue in this game, but that I don't know how they're going to treat in the remake because it is so not to modern sensibilities. 20 years ago, you kind of can do this as an artistic thing, but nowadays people are too sensitive. I don't know how they're going to deal with that. Speaking of things they can't do in the remake, we're introduced to Steve Burnside, Claire's kind of main love interest, and I don't mean that in an applied fandom kind of way. I mean that very directly. Like, the writers put that Steve had a huge crush on Claire, and it's not clear if it's reciprocated or not, but Claire definitely kind of feels that way by the end. And I won't spoil the twist, but of course, Steve unfortunately doesn't make it out alive. Even though it's kind of implying in the narrative he could have. I don't know if we'll ever see Steve again because it was implied that he would come back, or could have come back, but I don't think they really want to, because the problem and the great thing about Steve is that he is written as an intentionally annoying character, kind of. He's a very juvenile, naive kind of character, but then he goes through like some decent trauma, and like it makes sense the way he is, but his personality is very like anti-introspective. Like, the guy reacts to things immediately. He's kind of shallow-minded, very kind of a doofus, kind of a goof, but in an endearing kind of way. Like, he's super, super genuine to a fault, essentially. And honestly, I like him as a character, even though I'm saying he's kind of a bad character. Like, he's so over the top and so emotional and so cringy. It's endearing in a way, and that line between cringe and endearing, especially nowadays, is very taboo. Where it's like a character who's too earnest is seen as a bad character, which I don't agree with. Anyway, I love Steve, honestly. I just that in the remake, I don't know how they're gonna handle this guy, because he's like, oh cool, these guns that Claire gave me, I'm going to use these to fight the bad guys. Like, he's so juvenile, and it's endearing, but it's also kind of like this kind of writing would only fly in like an obscure early 2000s video game. And there's this one scene where Steve, he like jumps out a window firing 2 pistols. He's a total badass. And then Steve has to choose between Claire and like another important character. And then Steve has to like, then he gets, infected with the Veronica virus. And he's like, Claire, get back. I'm transforming. It's like it's the most Linkin Park like cringe AMV edits. And he has like this built-in, like, it's like a slave collar. I don't know why Claire didn't get one, or I know she almost got one, but like, he's a prisoner on the island, so he's this slave collar, and it looks like a choker, and there's just a lot of undertones, and he is, I wouldn't say a simp for Claire, but he has a total crush on Claire, to the point where it's part of the narrative. There's this one scene later where he's moving heavy machinery near the end of the game, and they're trying to escape. And as he's moving, and they're like, oh, we're finally going to escape, he literally starts staring at Claire and gets infatuated by her. And while he's moving this giant crane, he hits this giant pipe and leaks all this poison gas everywhere. And you have to run around and shut it off as Claire. Like, it's so it's so almost comical, like, for them to have the balls to be like, yeah, this guy's a retard. This guy's just he's just a big doofus, but he's a lovable doofus. Anyway, I hope they don't change anything about him, because to see that kind of character in 2026 or 27, whenever they release Veronica, would just be just wonderful. I think it would be very refreshing, honestly, to have that kind of character who almost feels semi-comical in his earnestness. But anyway, I digress. That's a whole other aspect. And so Steve definitely does take up a decent chunk of the game. There's one section where you play as him, but he's not really that long. And besides that, he doesn't have a huge role in the story in terms of lore. Like, he's just a character that's there, if you know what I mean. It's not like he's connected to the Ashfords, and it's not like he's connected to Claire or Chris or Leon, and he has some backstory. Like, he's just a guy, and he's a great guy, but he's just self-isolated to Code Veronica. So besides that, you mainly play as Chris and Claire. Well, mainly as Claire, and then a bit of Chris near the end. And they kind of, I thought they would do like a 1-2 kind of story thing, or maybe like Resident Evil 2 where you play as Chris during the same events, but no, it's one linear story where you play as Claire, then you do as Chris for the second half. Kind of, I mean, the structure of the game really threw me off because you're basically, Claire is basically kidnapped. It's actually really nice. Again, I do like how this game ties really well into Resident Evil 3. I do really like how this game ties into Resident Evil 3 because it says that Chris leaves for Europe, and that's why he's not in Raccoon City, and Jill stayed behind to do other stuff, and Barry went up to Canada to visit his family, and all these kind of contrived reasons to keep Jill in Raccoon City for the third game. It's actually kind of interesting now that I think about it. There's no pursuer in this game, and there's certain things about Code Veronica that feel a little bit, I don't know, like a little bit low quality at first when you start playing it. Like Resident Evil 3 felt a little bit better. Like 3 had a dodge system. 3 also had, again, the gunpowder system. And there's a lot of things in Code Veronica, again, that just feel like a step back. And again, because it was planned as a side story, but it ended up becoming the real I understand now why fans are so passionate, because this is like the real Resident Evil 3 from a story perspective. So it's like one of those games that was planned as a spin-off, but ended up having more weight and impact, not only from the characters, the story, the development, but it didn't have the backing of the gameplay, and it was obviously made by like a B team or something. So that's why it's such a weird little gem, is that it has all these cool things in it that don't exactly make it better, like in some cases, but it does make it more interesting in some cases. And I can see why, as a real Resident Evil fan, you would definitely want to play this to kind of fit into the story, especially if you're a real fan of the characters, especially because Chris basically goes to Paris, which is Umbrella's headquarters, where they go to essentially confront Umbrella after the Raccoon City incident. They're saying, okay, after the mansion, after Raccoon City, we now have to take it to task on an international scale. And so what's cool is that Claire essentially is following her brother. That's her single motivation, and also to take down Umbrella. So she ends up going to Paris, and it opens up in this CG Matrix-style cutscene where she's being chased down by this chopper, shooting down through the windows, and slow motion bullets going everywhere. You know, very, very cool stuff like that. And she basically gets captured, sent to this remote island in the south of the equator, like really south, and this called Rockfort Prison Island. And essentially one of the guys is South American, the first guy you meet, and he's basically the first guy you befriend. He's wounded, similar to Marvin in the second game, and so you have to find him pills, and if you do, you get a lockpick instead of lighter, which allows you to open up all the lock things in the game, giving you huge advantage, basically something you have to do. And that's kind of the first thing on the island, essentially, where you are essentially confronting the Ashfords. You're just trying to escape and survive. And what's really interesting is the story is that other characters show up, like Wesker. So Wesker's in this, and I would say Wesker's the more, well, not interesting, but it's really interesting to see Wesker in this, like, between state of Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 5. Because I thought in the broad scope of things, Wesker and Chris, that rivalry only exists in 1 and 5. And a lot of 5, you don't even see Wesker for almost more than half the game. It's only in the last third of Resident Evil 5 and the last act and sort of the industrial shipbuilding, whatever complex, is when you finally meet him. And I feel like for most Resident Evil players, if they hadn't played 1, even if you have played 1, he's really only at the end of the game there as well. So when you're introduced to him, he's like, who is this guy and why is he so cool? Like 7 minutes. 7 minutes is all I have to play with you. So it's really interesting to see the development of Wesker from Resident Evil 1 Wesker to Resident Evil 5. And so in this game, it's a perfect in-between. Again, it's a Chris and Wesker kind of confrontation. And so Chris and Wesker do fight, not in-game, but in cutscene. And what's really interesting is that Wesker here, he still has his Resident Evil 1 design, but he has mannerisms and movements from Resident Evil 5, which is really cool because you can see what kind of character they were building. Because the whole point of Wesker is that he was defeated in Resi 1, but he survived with the T-Virus and evolved essentially without becoming a tyrant. So in this game, he has supersonic speed, super powerful punching. His eyes glow red. They have, the demon thing behind it. In the cutscenes, he has this weird wave effect as he moves. So it's kind of like, and he has those sunglasses. So it's building up to the Wesker that he would become in the trench coat, but it's like a cool in between. So you see the evolution of the character design. It's kind of also interesting too because Chris in this game, when he fights him in the cutscene, obviously he loses. The only way he gets away is by dropping these giant steel beams on him, which weakens him. So obviously he's not even at his full strength, even in 5. And Chris himself, it's kind of funny because the inside character joke, I guess, is that because Chris gets his ass handed to him on Rockfort Island, it's kind of his incentive to kind of bulk out and really get those huge gorilla arms that you see him with in 5, and you have the whole boulder punching saga. So so Chris in this one, he's not really that much different from his Resi 1 iteration. The other thing about Chris is that you can tell his uniform, his demeanor, he kind of realizes he has to go outside the confines of the American government and join the BSAA to track down Wesker. There's also, I believe, ties into the Resident Evil 5 DLC where you actually replay that scene from the Ashcroft Island from Code Veronica where you confront Wesker. And it's an interesting scene because Chris is definitely on the island. He definitely fights Wesker, but they also include Jill in that. And that shows how Jill got captured, which is kind of an interesting semi-retcon because Jill is not in this game at all. But it's implied that's how she was captured. Or at least, was that at Oswald's Manor? I'm not sure. I mean, you have all your basic staples. You have the pistol, shotgun. You have an AK in this one. I love how the guns are still called after their real life names, essentially, because every game got copyrighted by using real guns in their game. Herb system is still here. It's the same. I feel it's decently generous. Still, you have your key items, key cards. The puzzles feel pretty much average. There's not as many mind puzzles where you have to like frig with it. It's usually like, here's a key item, go to the other side of the map and do that. So there is a lot of backtracking in this game to the extent that like you will end up going to the other side of the map. And I would say 90% of the time, it's very obvious what you have to do and where you have to go once you get an item. I think I only got stuck near the end where you have to turn off the electricity to disable this robotic lion head so you can get both gems to use to get the magic or the music disc rather. And what was frustrating to me is that at that point, the game's already kind of in the end state. And if you hadn't gotten that last piece of the Dragonfly puzzle yet, it feels really awkward to be running around while the final end music is playing. Also, to that point, I was very much thrown for a loop because the Rockford Island incident, which is about the first half of the game, it ends with a self-destruct sequence. So initially I thought, oh wow, this game's only like 6-7 hours long. It's going to end very quickly, just kind of like that. Because once you have a self-destruct sequence in a Resident Evil game, like that is it. That is the end of the game. And so throughout that section, I used all of my weapons, all of my ammo, everything. I just spilled it all out. And I was thinking, man, yeah, this is not a good game. It's a very basic side story. You have this crazy guy called Alfred. You have Claire doing her thing, but it's not great. And then, we escape the island with Steve, everything blows up and we, take out Alfred, or he escapes as well. And then suddenly the game continues and the airship that we escaped on is rerouted to the Antarctic, even more south. And I was like, oh, wait a second, hold on. The game's still going. I was literally, and even asked you, do you want to save for the first half of the game? So it was almost like a weird hedge where, I don't know, the development of this game is very interesting. It's a weird hedge where they made the first half and they kind of ended it and they made it its own self-contained story. But then I guess they were like, oh, we have more funding or we can do more stuff with this. And they were like, okay, well, we did Claire's story. We can do a little bit more of her, but what if we introduce Chris? So again, this feels like a project that started as a side story, ended up growing and developing to a full-blown, like, core line game, which again is just super interesting to me. I will say, though, the caveat, how I feel about it at the end of the day is that this feels like the Silent Hill 4 of the original series. You still have the classic tank controls before Resident Evil 4 would take over. And it's interesting how they were releasing these games almost yearly until this game, and then they took 4 years to develop Resident Evil 4 in '05, or 5 years actually. So I don't know, to me it's really, or was it '04? It doesn't matter. But it was really interesting how much quality went into this game and how at the same time, I like how much content there is, but the overall quality and design philosophy is not very advanced. It's really with 4, they really push it forward. I just find that super interesting, but it still feels like not amazing. Not amazing, like, to play. It feels more like, yeah, this is like a nice addition, but it isn't super necessary like Silent Hill 4. Which I do love, but it's also like a weird game in that it's kind of the end of the design philosophy of that genre or style of tank control games. And so from the second half of the game, you go through the Arctic facility, and you go up to half of that level with Steve, and you escape. And then, and I know it's the Arctic, and they have this trope, but like Steve and Steve and Claire wearing just these, very loose-fitting clothing in the Arctic and like -50 weather is just comical. Like there's this whole scene where they're being chased by this one kind of pursuer boss, and Steve is literally hanging on the ledge by one hand in like the sub-zero temperature, and so you have to do the whole boss fight and then come back to him and he's still just hanging there and you pull him up. It's just really ridiculous. Anyway, so you do that component, and what's interesting is you then start playing as Chris, and Chris is going through the Rockford Island and he is doing his own thing, and then he ends up basically doing kind of like the fast version of those levels, because all the puzzles that Claire couldn't do, he can do. And it's just like really fast-paced version of those levels. It's very linear. Well, Claire, there's a lot of backtracking. With Chris, it's very linear. They've like blocked off a lot of things. A lot of things are broken. And so it ends up being this thing where it's just more action-packed and fast-paced with Chris. And then, of course, Chris gets his own weapons. That's one big issue I had by the end of the game, is that Chris and Claire, technically they share an inventory by using the giant weapons box, but when you swap, you have no option to swap between them. There's one section where you play as Claire again very briefly for the end of the game, and whatever is in her inventory she keeps, and she's de facto done, and you play as Chris for the very last chapter of the game. So if there's anything in Jill's inventory that you need, like a weapon, and both of them can use either weapons, but if there's anything in the inventory that you need, it's locked to Claire. So it's this really frustrating foresight that if you could really screw yourself over if you're not careful. Fortunately for Claire, I only had her pistol and her bowgun, and Chris had everything else, which was great. But that could have gone very badly, I think, for some people, because you have no option to go back and switch unless you saved. Speaking of which, there were a few sections of this game that were just super hard. There's like there's certain sections where it's like I think once you get to the mansion in Rockford, there's like not a save point through like 3 areas. It's really ridiculous. You have to like backtrack just to save. There's also the final boss was a little bit just frustrating, just very frustrating, where it spawns these little minions you have to keep dealing with. And I thought I thought initially the final boss was one of these bosses where you have to do damage, but really you just have to run around and survive for 2 minutes, because there's this thing that's charging, that's the ultimate weapon. So like, okay, I just have to survive. So I kept running around for like almost 5 minutes, dying, and kept restarting when I realized and looked up, oh yeah, people complain about this boss, but you're just supposed to stand there and shoot it. So I was like, oh, okay. So I equipped my most powerful weapons, defeat it, and then once you defeat it, then the timer counts down, and then you can get the final weapon and destroy the final boss, essentially, with a weird thing called the linear launcher, which looks like some Tesla cannon or plasma gun or something, which is like, looks really cool. And yeah, and so, yeah, and especially at the end there, I remember it's a very frustrating section where you have this crystal ball crushing puzzle. And it's this one section where you're playing as Claire again after not playing as her for the second half of the game. And you have to do this one section as her using her equipment. And the issue is, in this section, she how do I say this? She has to do this whole section with no save points. There's no typewriter. So you have to do that whole section. And oh yeah, and then at the end of that section, you have to run away from this monster with the giant axe. And I just kept dying to it. I kept dying to it so many times, and you can't save. So, and like before that, because you haven't played as Claire for a while, you have to do all this inventory management, and it's super frustrating because you keep dying, so you lose way more time. So it became this thing where I didn't even manage my inventories. I just ran straight for the boss. But in order to get to the boss, you need to do this series of puzzles. I probably did this puzzle like a dozen times plus by the time I was done with it, because this boss isn't even really a boss, because it's like, it's implied that there's this closing gate, you're supposed to run away from him, but if you run away and you get hit twice, you die. I thought, okay, maybe I have to run to the left, run to the right, and you have like no time to react or figure out what to do. Maybe I have to shoot him until he dies. No, that doesn't work. So if you shoot him a little bit, he'll like get stunned, but it's not enough. So I realized the pinnacle or the peak is that you shoot him with an explosive immediately as he spawns. Then you turn and run like hell, and you only actually get hit once. And then you actually have to get to the cutscene and enter the hallway, and a cutscene will play. And it was so frustrating just figuring out that section. And then what's even more aggravating is after you do that section, you switch back to Chris, but it immediately goes into a boss fight. So the amount of times you're going to have to die and redo this one section is just so frustrating. It's really frustrating. I had to do that crystal ball crushing puzzle like a lot. So yeah, there's certain things in this game where it's just odd predicting how it's going to end or where it's going to end. I thought the first self-destruct sequence would be it. No, it's actually a whole other section as Claire, and then you play as Chris, and then Claire again, and then Chris, and then the final self-destruct sequence plays. It's like, okay, fine, fair enough, whatever. Another thing I will also say is the voice acting in this game. It ranges from mediocre or okay to just straight up bad. Steve is a whiny little character, but I love him. But really, it's Wesker. Wesker is mostly okay, but he has all these sections where he has to do this fake evil laugh, and it's really bad. Like, it's cut content bloopers. We should not put this in the game bad. Like it's very, very cheesy. I think Wesker has the cheesiest dialogue in this whole game, but he's still kind of like a solid part of the experience. But yeah, this is interesting. It's Claire's game. She's never really had a real full frontal game. It's also interesting how there's a lots of mirroring effects between, again, you have Claire and Chris, brother and sister, against another brother and sister pair. And of course, you have the Veronica virus. What's interesting about the Veronica virus is that that's the other thing. Code Veronica, you actually get to learn very quickly a lot about the Ashford family, and because they implement it in the form of puzzles, so you get to understand the family history. And so Veronica is the kind of progenitor of their royal lineage, and so that's why she's used as this kind of iconic character that they're trying to aspire to be. The other interesting thing about the Veronica virus is that it seems to give the character not only, of course, immortality and superpowers, but it gives them like firepower, so they can deduct fire. And that reminds me of the same powers that we would see in Resident Evil The Dark Side Chronicles with the original South American plot of Leon and Krauser, where you have Manuela, who also, I think, develops fire bending, essentially, which is, I guess, a side effect they decided just is going to happen now. So, along with the T virus, it gives you a pyrokinetic. Yeah, there's also a lot of decent lore in this game, how Umbrella was created, how the T virus functions, how the Veronica virus functions. There's a few new enemies that are honestly mostly annoying, like a poison hunter and these giant golden guys who have this huge arm range. But yeah, overall, Code Veronica, it's a very solid game. I think it's definitely something for diehard Resident Evil fans. But it's not something that is super amazing at the end of the day. I think it's really cool they're remaking it. I think it's important a little bit for the story going forward, just because it's another Chris game and we just don't get a lot of those essentially, so it's kind of cool like that. But yeah, it's a very competent, decent game. But on the whole, when I'm thinking about it, I don't know if I'd rank it higher than Resident Evil 3, even though that is literally like a very spin-off story. It was like, what did Jill do doing Raccoon City? It's very kind of basic in its story, but mechanically and the pacing of it, it feels really good. There's also just something slightly weird about the Dreamcast graphics, where it's slightly like mature, if that makes sense. Like you can see people's fingers, it's very developed rather, but it feels like it has this weird budget constraint that makes it feel like it's not quite sure what the game should look like. Everything was proportioned correctly in the previous games, the scope of the manner and the scale of the character models, while here it feels a little bit campy in a weird way, but again, it's fine. Everything about Code Veronica is a little weird and off and is special and all. We love our flaws and all that kind of. The other thing I was actually very excited to see about the adaptation of this one is that I was actually playing it on the Xbox, and so if you actually look at the button layout of the Dreamcast, I didn't realize this, but the Dreamcast and Xbox controller have the exact same button layout with the control sticks and the ABXY. It's just that they actually have reverse colors for each set of buttons, which I thought was really interesting. So this is the most authentic way you can play without actually owning a Dreamcast, which I thought was pretty cool. Again, the story between Alexis and Alfred is kind of unique. The setup of this kind of whole game is very unique, and even though it feels and is designed like a side story or people who weren't familiar with the Resident Evil formula, it still falls very nicely into the whole chronology of the mainline titles. But yeah, there's not much else to say. Code Veronica, it's a weird, little janky, but very core, decently made game, and it's definitely a gem, and I see why people like it. Was it overhyped in the past? Maybe a little bit, you could argue that, but I think for what it is, it's competent, and again, I'm just glad they're actually remaking it, because it is worth getting into, if only for the hype of Wesker and Chris, and just having another Chris game in the repertoire of the series. Anyway, that's pretty much it, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.